In the summer of 2013, I liberated some maple from a vacant lot that wasn't too far from our house. Now, as usual, it had been cut into shorter sections so it could be moved easier. One thing that you can do with this, which is nice, is to turn the pieces on the lathe into bowls and such things. So I sliced up the pieces into bowl blanks with the chainsaw and then into smaller pieces on the bandsaw. Then I turn the pieces on the lathe into bowls, basically. So it's sort of the first step of making a bowl with a green piece of wood. Once the rough shape is made, I can then paint it with wax paint, which will allow it to dry more slowly and thus more evenly, and it won't crack, hopefully. So this will now sit for a year or more and dry. All right. So this is the bowl that I turned down almost exactly a year ago. I got a faint date on there, November something, 2013. So it's been almost exactly a year. It's got one little crack right here. So the thought I think I'm going to do is turn down a lot of this height and then do something over this crack. So that's what we'll do. Now the bowl had changed shape a little bit as it dries. It tends to shrink in one direction more than the other direction. So the chuck wouldn't fit back in the hole that I had for it. So I just attached a faceplate to the back of the bowl to hold it on the lathe. I re-rounded up the bowl so it's round again and a little bit thinner. What I would like to do is to add a walnut ring at the top of the bowl. So I took a piece of walnut and I jointed it to get it nice and straight, and then planed it to get it even. And I have a 15-degree angle on my sled so that I can cut 12 segments for the ring that'll go around the top of the bowl. With these segments, I numbered them and I made a double cut at each cut so that the grain direction would match up on the ring, so that the pieces don't flip between each one. Now the ring is dry, and we can see how it's going to go on the bowl. What I need to do is sand the two surfaces that are going to meet up between the bowl and the ring. So I'll sand the ring and then the bowl. Then you can see that those are going to fit with no gaps in between. And some glue, put it on there. I want that little crack to fall in the center of one of the segments. And then flip it over. My trick for clamping one ring and a bowl is to cut a scrap piece of wood that's the length of the height of the bowl and the ring, and then clamp that to a scrap piece that's the width of my table, and then clamp both ends of that. That provides pressure for the ring and the bowl to go together. And back to the lathe. And at this point, I realize I really should get the foot of the bowl cleaned up so that I can use my chuck in the bottom of the bowl. And I really should have done this before I put the ring on so that the bowl wasn't sticking out from the chuck quite so much. So now the chuck will fit in the bottom of the bowl. I can mount the bowl with the smaller chuck now without the faceplate and clean up the ring a little bit more. Now we're going to completely change gears. About 3 months ago, Philippe Singh, who lives in Japan and has been making and selling a metal version of Matthias's Pantorouter, sent me an email asking if he could send me one to use and to review and to do a video with. So I thought about this for about a week, wondering what I could use it for. I've had this idea for a while that I've really wanted to do segmented turning that isn't so square. It's not so rectilinear and straight, and do curves somehow within the segments of the pattern of the turning. I was beginning to realize that this was the tool that would let me do that. So I put the Pantorouter together, and it was straightforward. You can see with this device, you make a pattern up above and sort of behind. That's the red thing in the image. And then you can follow that pattern and it moves the router bit based on that pattern. So you can cut multiple shapes with the router that are the same. Now what I've mostly seen this used for is making joinery, mortise and tenons and finger joints and dovetail joints and those sorts of things. But what I wanted to do with this was to make the shapes for segmented turning, which I thought this would work for because I could make both the hole that something would go in and the piece that would go in that hole. Basically like inlay work. I drew lots of different things and thought about different things I could do, whether it be a star or a foot or something. But I ended up taking a paisley pattern and making a shape from that, which is sort of now a bean or a pear or a raindrop or something in that vein, and made a pattern from that. So the first way that I started to do this was to use the idea in the patterns that were sent with the machine, in that you have an inner shape and an outer shape, and one is for the mortise and one is for the tenon, basically. So what I tried to do is to make my shape in the same way, where I would have an inner shape and an outer shape. And this worked, in theory, but it wasn't giving me a great fit between the two pieces. It's because I wasn't able to cut the two shapes exactly the same or exactly parallel by hand. I could print them and they looked right, but I couldn't make them well enough. I discovered that there was a different technique of making the pattern for the Pantorouter, which is to cut out a shape that you're going to make and then use that cut line for both patterns so that your guide on the pattern follows one for the positive and then one for the negative. So what I had to do was get a piece of really thin plywood and then cut the shape out with an X-Acto blade so that there wouldn't be any kerf between the two shapes, and then mount that to a piece of thicker plywood, which could then be mounted to the machine. The other half to this was that I needed to make a guide that was 1 inch in diameter, which would be twice the diameter of the router bit that I was using. The guide that comes with the Pantorouter is a little bit less than 1 inch and works with the guides that come with the machine. And what I did was to make my little cylinder have a taper to it so that I could adjust the fit of the joint with the cylinder. My first cut with it, I did it in the same 2x4 material that I had been using. And this didn't really come out that great, and I was a little worried. So I tried it in the material that I was going to be using on the bowl, and this worked a lot better. I think actually using a finer grained, better quality wood really helps with the cut of the pieces. My first attempt was just a little bit loose, but it looked good. So I moved my guide just a little bit, and that tightened up the fit, and it fit really nicely. Then it was finally time to start cutting the bowl, which was a little bit nerve-wracking. It took a day of kind of thinking about it and wondering how I should do it exactly, and doing more tests and making sure everything was going to work just exactly right, because I only had one chance with the bowl. And I had 12 of them to do, and I didn't want to have one that I screwed up. First was to put the template or the pattern in the right place. And the first one I wanted to do was to take care of the last little bit of the crack that was in the bowl. So I mounted the pattern, and I marked on some tape where the bowl was going to go for each segment, so they would fall in the same place. And I just clamped the bowl to the table, which worked really well. And then it was the moment of truth. And it's no turning back now. First a light pass, then a little deeper, and it actually worked really well. My fear was that the bowl was going to move as I was doing it, so I had it clamped really well to the table. And it feels nice and smooth. Then I take the clamps off, have a look, rotate, make sure everything's lined up, clamp it back again, and we're ready for the next one. What's nice is the pattern just stays in the same place, and the router just stays in the same place. So it's just a matter of turning the workpiece for each cut. I was doing 2 passes per hole, once it got going, it went pretty quickly. One constraint I had was that I had a 1/2 inch router bit for the router, so I couldn't make a radius less than 1/2 inch in my shape. It made a lot of chips. I'm going to need to figure out dust collection. So the next thing is to make the piece that fits within the hole. I'll put that pattern on. Now I got this piece of wood, and now I've completely forgotten what kind of wood it is, but it's sort of a light kind of reddish brown, tight grained hardwood for the segments that'll go in the holes. So I just cut a bunch of these along one edge of the piece of wood. That went pretty fast. I did do one test one first and cut that one off to make sure it would fit right in the holes, and it worked. And I went to cut the rest of them off, and I got 2 of them cut off, and then all of a sudden it wouldn't move anymore. I couldn't figure out why it wasn't going anywhere. So I turned the saw off, and I looked at everything, puzzled, and I found a little piece come off and gotten stuck in the blade. So these little sections that didn't get cut off by the router ended up being a little bit of a problem. But it was an easy fix, and I sliced off the rest of them. And then they can go in the bowl. And they fit. And they're actually pretty tight. And then it's just a matter of adding some glue. Now I didn't need any clamps for this. They just kind of fit in. And I put in a lot of glue just to make sure it would all fill in around the edges. And then let it dry overnight. That look good. And now we're ready to finish it up. With a bigger piece like this, I like to put my hand on the top of the lathe as I'm bringing the piece up to speed. And I can feel when the lathe just starts to vibrate, that's when it's going too fast. And then I back it off just a little bit from that. Now this was actually really well balanced. And it didn't get to that point where the lathe would start to vibrate. So I left it at about 450 or so, which felt about right. I started with the outside. Got that pretty close. And did a little bit of the edge. Got that about right. Then I cleaned up the inside. Then the bottom of the inside. Once I had the inside done and that shape sort of finalized, I could work on the bottom of the outside. And I wanted to not go too much deeper on the inside and then cut off a bunch of the bottom on the outside. So that's what I did. So I ended up with sort of a foot on the bottom of the bowl. I scraped everything, get it a little smoother. I was having a little bit of an issue with vibration on the bowl, just because I think it was getting a little thin and it was a little big. So I didn't get a really smooth surface when I was doing the scraping, so I had to do a lot of sanding. And I started with my grinder with a sanding disc on it, then went through all the sanding grits up to 600. Now the main part of the bowl is done, and I can reverse the bowl and work on the bottom. That foot piece I wanted to take off and just have the bowl come down to the bottom with a smooth curve. And I can take off the little nubbin from the tailstock and very carefully smooth that out, and then do a little sanding on the bottom. Now doing a bottom like this lets me do something I haven't really done before, which is to actually put the finish on the bowl on the lathe, which I actually found much easier than trying to do it on the table like I usually do it. I squirted it off with some air. I cleaned the rest of the dust off with some mineral spirits. Then it was time for finish. I've had grand plans of making some beeswax linseed oil finish, but I still haven't gotten to that yet, so I'm just using tung oil this time, which works well. It was much easier doing the finish on the lathe. And we're done. And it turned out really nice. The segments actually fit better than I thought they were going to before I started this whole process. Some of them aren't exactly perfect, but I think most of that is just the way that I tracked the pattern on the Pantorouter, because there's some of the segments that fit just exactly perfect, which is really, really nice. So for doing multiple shapes, whether it's joinery or wood turning or something else that anyone can think of, this is a really nice machine to have. Thanks for watching.